When you live a life caged by colonial borders, an urge for freedom is overwhelming. Now, when negative provides you no legal recourse to get that freedom, the alternative is simple and the alternative is clear. The alternative is violence. Clearly, when you have this lust for freedom and there is no way of obtaining it, bloodshed will flow. And on side Affirmative, we replace the gun with a legal mechanism. We staunch the bloodshed and we provide freedom for those who need it most without the violence that negative must endure. A few things in the speech then: an argument on characterization, then a principle, and then explaining why we reduce conflict and explaining the benefits of statehood. First of all then, explaining characterization. I think an explanation of what this policy is and how it works will kind of clarify this debate a bit. First, just explaining what the policy of non-recognition is. Some historical context. When the AU's predecessor, the OAU, recognized post-colonial borders due to as kind of set after World War II as a result of just kind of conflict wariness. People were aware of the harms of border instability and therefore were just like, we're not switching it up, these are the borders. When the AU in the early 2000s was formed, they decided to carry through this policy instead of inventing it on its own, and all acting states transferred their ability to kind of decide their own boundaries to the AU. This means it was the state and not the members that were doing this. What is the counterfactual then, given this historical context? First, I think it is upon the formation of the AU in around 2002, we would engage differently with this kind of border concern. How would we kind of go, how do we think it is likely this get going about? First, I think people would be aware of the caution of instability this negative team are likely to talk about. These are states that are aware of the harms of border conflicts, aware of the harms of secession, so would likely have some high barrier for accessing this metric. Second of all, they'll provide specific and clear circumstances for stable states to be able to gain statehood. This would be things like you don't threaten regional stability, you show you have some capacity for governance. This isn't just allowing any state that determines that they are in fact independent to gain statehood. The conclusion of this is that there'll be a rather high and clear barrier for people to gain statehood, to reduce violence and to reduce instability. What are this criteria are, and also this would likely be done by an independent board instead of a vote by the AU, because every individual state would be aware of the threat of politicking by every other state. So while it might be beneficial for you as an individual to have a voting system, you're aware that everyone else would probably mess around. So this means everyone would likely defer to an independent panel. So what would this criteria likely look like then? First, it would have to be a state is demonstrating willingness to engage peacefully and diplomatically with members of the AU. That is, if you have a state that aims to become a state and has only shown an ability to do violence and has shown no ability to be diplomatic, it would be unlikely to gain this ability to statehood. Second of all, they have to show a capacity to provide the services of a state that they are replacing. This is like Somaliland having elections, having basic state infrastructure, etc. Third of all, this would probably have some clear distinguishing need for the state to exist. Whether this be different religious, cultural, or other barriers kind of justify the state's existence onto itself. Given all of this framing, I think it would be somewhat rare for this kind of secession process to occur and be successful. It would occur, but it wouldn't happen every single year. Clearly, this is kind of like a high barrier to meet. First, kind of second argument then, on the notion of the principle. And the principle here is quite intuitive. Sure.
So are you saying that you imagine that countries will voluntarily and without conflict give up part of their country if these criteria are met?
Well, I think upon the formation of this system of voting, people wouldn't be having any imminent threat, and so people in the abstract could agree to this system. While it might be somewhat undesirable for the state at the time, it would have already opted into this. Second of all, I do think they would do it because the alternative is a huge quantity of violence. And as I explained, it is currently the AU's domain to determine new borders. They probably just want a new country so they don't have to deal with huge levels of violence. Firstly then, on the principle. I think the principle here is intuitive. It is wrong for an institution built upon past colonial boundaries to suppress statehood. Why is this the case? First, the state is the manifestation of someone's personhood. It is what they surrender in order to get different kinds of security and representation. Clearly, people should have some level of freedom in their state. Second of all, it is an ability for them to have distinctness in their identities, and this is something that is suppressed when you can't be your own independent state. Third of all, as explained before, these are borders not based on any historical or cultural foundation, but one based on colonial line drawing and scribbling on a map. This means it is an especially bad representation of statehood. Therefore, it is especially pernicious when we don't allow any kinds of reforms for this. This means people have a principled right to have some process of obtaining statehood, and this is a right that has been denied to them. Next argument then on an explanation about why this reduces conflict more generally. First piece of context here is that there are loads of current separatist groups in the African Union, and they know they cannot gain the legitimacy and the safety of statehood because they are barred from doing so. What does this mean? This means that the only way they can secure any kind of freedom, any kind of security, is through violence, by having militaries and militants having large amounts of guns and weapons, drawing lines in the sand, saying this is our country, with none of the international recognition that prevents any kind of encroachment. It means that you don't allow free movements of people in and out of the territories you claim, because there is no mechanism of citizenship, and you do oppress the people in the areas you occupy. And because of this, these kind of institutions that, while they wouldn't like to be, are forced to be violent. Therefore, how do we reduce violence? First, there is a clear mechanism for secession from the country you were in. This means pretty much, instead of dedicating your time to violence and fear and treachery in order to have some kind of security, you dedicate it to the art of statecraft. You generate things like welfare, elections, and the support of a state in order to ensure you meet the legitimacy that we set out in our framing. Second of all, it means that it's far harder to radicalize individuals to be soldiers of your cause, because generally, people don't like fighting and they don't like the threat of dying. So there needs to be quite a high barrier to conscript someone. And this current barrier is telling them that there is no other way for you to be free from an oppressive country. And the second we provide a method of legal recourse, you can't have individuals telling this lie. And this means that there is far less ability for even individual radicals to conscript a bunch of people to do a bunch of violence for them. Third of all, we provide far better relationships with central governments. That is, when you have a government of a country who knows there is no threat of secession from any group or territory within its country, there is very little incentive for them to be nice to the minorities or the people who are kind of outside of the reach of statehood, because they just know there's nothing they can do about it. This means it can be super deprivatory and not provide services and systems to people who are either just regionally isolated in your country, who are just a minority of your population, whether this be religiously or ethnically or whatever, and this means you can just mistreat them and abuse them. However, when we introduce the system of secession, there is now an active incentive to be kinder to these people, to provide these people services, and even if there isn't, these people can secede and organize and provide themselves the benefits of statehood. The argument here, the impact here is very clear and very intuitive. Violence is something that is bad, and violence is something that is inevitable under the side negative. It costs lives, it costs regional instability, it costs investment, and it costs infrastructure. The more violence we produce and the more peace we produce, the more benefits we clearly accrue inside Affirmative. Finally then, an explanation on the benefits of statehood unto themselves. Because clearly there are going to be isolated groups on the side negative who can never secede and gain the benefits of statehood. So why is it preferable then that these groups can form states instead of being the military organizations they are in the status quo? First, you have far greater control over your internal affairs the second you gain the recognition of statehood. It is far easier for you to standardize system of taxation and welfare, distribution and redistribution to ensure the quality of life of the citizens in your country. Second of all, you can directly access aid from international organizations, whether this be NGOs or just charitable groups, who can now actively target and support people within your country if it is somewhat impoverished. Third of all, you gain access to various international organizations that can provide you loans, support, and justice, whether this be the IMF, whether this be like an international court that kind of regulates war crimes or other kinds of injustices against you and your people. So, we provide people the principled right of statehood that they have been denied. We reduce violence that will rage and continue to rage on the side negative. We ensure that people gain the security of statehood. So proud to affirm.
Side negative will win this debate in two ways. Firstly, we'll explain why this absolutely fractures the African Union in a way that is the largest harm in this debate. Secondly, we'll explain how this emboldens separatist movements in a way that only escalates conflicts and the number of crises that afflict this nation. Before that, I want to rebut the central claim that underpins the Affirmative's case, which is that recognizing these states provides a legal mechanism to stay an otherwise inevitable conflict. In the first instance, we contest that this conflict is inevitable. Like we look at the example in the info slide of Somaliland. Somaliland is not in an active conflict with Somalia, despite not being recognized by Somalia. And that speaks to the two case scenarios of what these separatist movements look like in the status quo. Because either these separatist movements are presiding over sufficiently large swathes of land that they're able to function relatively internally stably, like Somaliland, such they don't need to embark on a war to exhaust more resources, or they don't have enough land, which means also they don't have the capacity to go into conflict with the nation that they're trying to separate from. So, in the first instance, that conflict is not likely. But secondly, and devastatingly for side negative, they assume that member states will just comply and give up the land peacefully. We would suggest that the reason as to why this African Union embarked upon this policy of non-recognition was because the inverse would occur. But also, secondly, I just want to rebut the implied characterization of Affirmative team to suggest why nations will roll over. but they suggest these separatist movements rely on a broad base of sympathy because they are anti-colonial movements, which is not verified by the very example in the info slide. Like, Somaliland wants to retreat to previous colonial lines. And I think that speaks to the complexity of these questions of separatism, which is there is no clear answers, and there is fierce opposition from both sides, which means you cannot resolve this conflict without bloodshed. We cannot open this can of worms without dying. We would rather that the can does not stay open, stay closed. Firstly then, why does this fracture the African Union? I want to know that if you believe this argument is true, that's already fatal for this affirmative team, because they rely upon a strong African Union to act as an intermediary to assume that this conflict does not escalate during the process of this separation. There are two premises to prove here. The first is to explain why recognizing this constitutes a direct undermining of the sovereignty of the member states. I think trivially this is true, so the real import of this claim is to explain how this undermines sovereignty in a way that these member states will find unconscionable. There are three things that they need to sacrifice. The first, they need to sacrifice significant large swathes of land. Land that's often resource rich or at the very least arable. Land that is often tends to be privately owned, which means that not only do you have to give up land, you also have to forcibly displace many people who live on that land, which already represents an economic burden that often these member states cannot cope with. Secondly, you have to give up large swathes of your population. In particular, you have to give up swathes of the young working age population. These countries often have a scarcity of people that could otherwise be going to your skilled workforce. Thirdly, violence is often necessary for the reason that a lot of people already kind of live on this land. You need to forcibly remove that. The only way to do that is through militarily forced expulsions, and that is likely in the case we are often talking about when we're considering, for example, like Biala in Nigeria and West Sahara in Morocco. These were nations that previously engaged in civil war over these land disputes, which suggests that violence is the only means, which suggests that violence is inherent to the process of separation. So, secondly then, so the upshot of this is to explain not just that member states will oppose these separate movements in general, but they would vigorously oppose any action that could possibly imply the legitimacy of these separatist movements, given that doing so would represent an existential threat to the fabric of their nation. Secondly then, why would they then leave the African Union? Three mechanisms here. Firstly, because now you've essentially tied endorsement of the African Union to endorsement of the legitimacy of these separate movements in a way that clearly discourages member states from actively and diplomatically engaging with the African Union. But secondly, and crucially, you embolden separatist movements within these member states at the point at which the African Union body has given them the stamp of approval in a way that clearly escalates the problem within these nations, and therefore these member states have to pull out because they want to otherwise combat that air of legitimacy. And thirdly, because at the very least, right, like this question of separatism is probably sufficiently controversial within the domestic population of these countries, such to generate a huge amount of public outcry, and therefore that generates domestic pressure for the governments of these countries to leave an organization that otherwise endorses that. Why is that incredibly harmful? There are two key benefits of the African Union which are essential and outweigh them. Before that, yeah.
Violence is not the only imperative in this debate. Why should regions that have been oppressed from their governing governments not have access to things like the ICJ, not have access to institutions like the IMF?
Right, no, so you were kind of assuming that it comes part and parcel with recognition of the African Union. What I'm going to explain in my second argument is that it clearly does not, right? So firstly, on the benefits of the African Union. One, trade. The important thing to understand is that the continent of Africa does have one shared objective, and that shared objective is to serve and mount a unified front against the European Union. European Union, which engages in divide and conquer tactics, picks off individual African states by forcing them to sign deals that favor European imports, but still discourages African exports. And the fact that each individual African country is not sufficiently wealthy and cash flush to be a good negotiating partner necessarily means that the way in which Africa deals with that as a continent is to collectivize under a multilateral trade organization such as the African Union, which therefore supersedes the need for any one individual country to individually bargain against the bully that is the European Union. Secondly, on conflict resolution, the key thing to understand, and they can see this, is that the African Union serves as an important forum for mediating bilateral conflicts. And we know the risk of conflict in this continent is high, for the reason that, as they can see, there is a history of war, often that these nations have competing identities, the scars of colonialism. The important thing to understand, though, is that the African Union acts as a third-party mediator there. Now, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, it's a very high bar for us to prove that these member states will leave, but that's not only what we have to prove. Like, in the worst case, these nations will member states will leave entirely, but our harms still scale. They might just participate less in the African Union. They deprioritize it. They don't send the diplomats anymore. They're willing to give up far less when it comes to trade deals because you have to compromise on the table. And that harms the ability of the African Union to provide benefits to the entirety of Africa rather than the very few nations that these countries benefit. But lastly, they don't even benefit the people that exist within these separate movements, and I'm going to explain how. Why is that the case? The first thing to explain is why this increases the frequency of separatist movements in a way that's only disadvantageous. It's because it reduces the disadvantages of separatism that would otherwise deter them in two ways. Firstly, because it clearly gives them diplomatic recognition, and that's quite important because it changes the risk calculus of these nations, especially if they're already in a civil war, which is to say that at the point at which you know that engaging in separatism means you won't get any diplomatic coverage. So that means that at the point at which you're losing a war, or even like drawing a war, you're likely to come to the table and end the war to avoid that problem from happening. But secondly, and this is quite important, it gives the ideology of these separatist movements incredible power. The reason why these separate movements care is because they have a revealed preference to care about ideological legitimacy, but also because ideological endorsement is how these movements gain buy-in, how they recruit people to join their movement, which is why this practically empowers these separatist movements. But why does that only empower separatist movements to their detriment? Firstly on crises, secondly on conflict. On crises, this deals the best case, which is assuming that these separatist movements even create a state. The problem is, just because the African Union recognizes you, doesn't mean the rest of the world does. The US will never recognize Somaliland because its greatest ally at the Horn of Africa is Somalia. China will never, ever encourage, recognize a separatist country because of Taiwan. And that's just their fixed incentives to never recognize these nations and put them on the blacklist. So all you do, in fact, is just deny them the ability to receive the very aid this thing assumes is held in the bank. That is precisely what you lose. But lastly, you increase the risk of conflict for the very simple reason that A, clearly the process of it requires conflict, but secondly, you promote and increase the incentive for these domestic governments to crack down upon ethnic minorities before they engage in separatism to proactively deter that issue. We are very proud to oppose.
As recently as last year, hundreds of people in Somaliland were killed by clashes and skirmishes between Somalian militias and people who lived within Somaliland. It is a lie that this team tells you when they say that the people who live in states in anything but name enjoy the rights and the stability of people who live in states with names, because they don't. These are people who've been denied the ability to define and access their own future. It is incredibly unjust for the African Union to remain and become a vestige of the very thing it was determined to oppose, which was the colonial determinism that was imposed upon the African continent, that has precipitated violence untold, bloodshed untold. We are the team that is brave in this debate and says that maybe there are some bumps in the road to getting there, but we should try and walk it anyway. Let's firstly explain why the functioning of the African Union, both in general and during this process, will be done well and will not lead to one of the two, kind of catastrophic instances that this team says it will. And then I'll explain why this reduces conflict, which is the clearest path to victory in this debate, because the kind of ethnic tension that arises when militia groups feel like the only option they have is to pick up a gun because there is no state and no institution that cares about them is the most live issue in this debate. Let's first explain the functioning of the AU during this process. First question to explain here is why would the African Union not fall apart? And I'm going to start with the most ambitious goal of this negative team, because I think everything else that they point to on the road leading up to this is really vague. It is actually unclear that you could stop sending people to the Africa, all of the other stuff that they try to claim as well will win in those instances as well is actually incredibly is unclear, given the wide variety of functions that the African Union serves. Incredibly unlikely that you would engage with it in that way to a substantial detriment. First reason that the AU is unlikely to fall apart is because of the incredibly long history of participation of current member states with both the AU and its predecessor that date all the way back to the colonial breakup on the African continent, the end of World War II. And that is not just a symbolic, that's not a symbolic relationship. That is a practical relationship. When this team tells you about the way that various colonial powers continue to try to impress their will on the African continent, it was sticking together that helped to combat that. It was forming blocks, it was forming alliances, it was setting up things like, for instance, the courts and tribunals that exist within the OAU and now the AU as its successor, to combat things like ethnic cleansing, to get justice against people like warlords. The wide variety of functions that member states have come to enjoy, and especially into the 21st century, where there was clearly such an overwhelming opportunity for trade and for development and growth on that continent. Unlikely that you would give up that sort of enormous set of benefits there. The second is that there are large trade partners, large economies within the African Union who did not have kind of really pressing states in anything in all but name, like Somalia, within their countries, like Nigeria, like other large economies who did place a premium on things like stability so that they could continue to flourish as relatively large economies that would likely put significant pressure to keep it together. Third is that there are vested large power interests in stability and continuity of institutions on the African continent. Perhaps it is the case that they might like to pick apart relationships for the sake of, say, getting greater trade leverage over one or more countries in the African Union, but the entire breakdown of, say, like the largest human rights courts on that continent that do deliver things like findings on ethnic cleansing and on genocide, that do provide like kind of healing and reconciliation. The breakdown of those sets of institutions would be catastrophic for the set of larger countries that do engage in trade and aid with those countries as well. That would be pretty bad for them. So it is very unlikely that the AU crumbles, and there is a wide variety of functions that it serves. And the mechanism that we give you at Lachie as well is to say that this is a question of trade-offs in a relative abstract before these issues have become really live, which is why they are willing to accept it at this instance. In many of the same ways that countries trade off parts of their sovereignty to engage in the ICJ when they give them jurisdiction over particular issues, when one of those issues isn't right on their doorstep. And yes, maybe if it was in that circumstances, in those circumstances, they'd be less likely. They would be less likely to. The second question that this team asks that this team begs is on the stable transition. And I would firstly note that the decision is made by internal mechanisms of the African Union in which it is best placed to do, because it does run things like internal tribunals that determine these kinds of issues in accordance with international law. The decision, however, then secondly, is enforced by member states and neutral parties. It is also just ridiculous for this team to suggest that nobody outside of the African Union would recognize these states. The precise reason why they can't recognize these states is because the African Union does not, and it would jeopardize diplomatic relationships with an entire continental union of states and not just one. The first is because third thing to say here is that in many instances the use of force is not required to transition, because there are places like Somaliland where the largest, like the enormous proportion of the population that already lives there has expressed a will to continue to be a state in that respect. But fourthly, when you allow the African Union to actually participate in these types of discussions, which they currently just cannot because they cannot countenance it, it is against their policies, that is the moment at which you have a number of neutral observers and parties in that situation to, for instance, negotiate the fair treatment of other ethnic groups who continue to remain within those borders, negotiate the fair movement of people, perhaps even compensation for some of the territory and resources that are lost. None of that you get if that territory is functionally controlled by people who have no choice but to draw a line in the sand and point a gun at you if you try to cross it. What does this team say? They firstly say you lose many valuable things. I would question how valuable many of these things are. We have a population who is disgruntled and doesn't want to work for you. We have a population who protect those resources with guns and keep you from accessing them. That is actually what is keeping many sets of natural resources and oil fields and minerals locked up in these kinds of conflicts on the continent. They secondly say that it is an affront to your sovereignty. It is not. That individual decision is not made on the spot in a vacuum. Those kinds of decisions are made. So, like, say for instance, if the ICJ makes a ruling against you when you are a signatory to it, that is not an affront to your sovereignty, because you traded off that part of your sovereignty when you allowed it jurisdiction over those decisions in the first place. So if you agree at the end of this that because of the wide variety of functions that the AU gives these countries on a logical level, the long history that they have with it, that they would in those circumstances trade off the prospective future that maybe one day, if a state or state-like group of people managed to demonstrate such an extraordinary degree of statecraft that they were able to legally secede, that they might allow those agreements to be made, then that is an instance where we win. That is an instance in which sovereignty is still respected. I'll take a POI.
Oh, yeah, practically speaking, if all of these things were true, why did they have absolutely no mechanism at the point of founding? Like, why were they so concerned?
They were it is fine, guys, to say that institutions, when they made decisions in the past, were wrong in the arc of history. That is why we have regret debates. We are doing this debate with the prospect, with like the benefit of hindsight, and with the benefit of seeing situations like Somaliland, seeing situations like Western Sahara. We have 90+% of the population answering a referendum saying that they express a willingness and a desire to be their own state, and are denied on the basis of decisions that were made 70 years prior. Like, that is why I regret this policy. That is why this team will win. Let's talk about the reduction of conflict, and it is the thing that you should care the most about in this debate, because an absence of conflict is the precursor for the absolute greatest of human flourishing and all of everything that flows on from that. What does this team say? They say, well, their basic counter mechanism is around the behavior of separatist groups. The first thing I'd like to ask is who you think separatist groups or people who amount to separatist states are, because they are not crazy terrorists. They are people with legitimate cultures and forms of governance. The second and more important response, though, is how unnuanced do you think the message that these groups receive are? Like, this relies on a very stupid interpretation of this policy, because this is a departure from a long-time policy in a very cautious and and burdensome way. That does not mean that every separatist group in Africa is like, great, they're definitely going to let us be a state now, let's go kill everyone. Rather, it incentivizes the things that we described to you at Lachie, of improving your statecraft, of demonstrating that you have a connection to that land and to those people, and you have a right to govern for yourself. Truly never prouder to propose.
Whether it's the people of West Papua, Palestinians, the Berbers of Morocco and Algeria, the South Congolese, or whoever, history has shown us that people yearn for self-determination, for cultural autonomy and inherent recognition of their personhood and distinctness. That yearning does not go away regardless of what the policies of international institutions are. Rather, the only thing that changes in this debate is how people go about actualizing their goals, whether they pursue that through violence or whether they pursue it by identifying their capacity for statehood and making a persuasive case. We regret a policy that has denied people that autonomy, but also has resulted in decades of violence within Africa and will result in violence for years to come. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. I'm firstly going to deal with this question of violence and how both secession movements and the losing state reacts. Then I'm going to look at state building and also how this interacts with international actors. And then finally, with a principle that this negative team has done basically jack all to engage with. Before that though, let's make one clarification around efficacy. Their claim is this can just never be satisfied. You can just never get a non-violent movement. You can never show that institutions have been established, right? Look, this is a bit of a gripe I have with debating right now, but I just think the average intelligent voter should know a fucking thing or two about Africa. It is objectively the case, as 50 world schools teams showed you in world schools last year, that Somaliland does collect taxes. They do have somewhat of a functioning government. They maybe don't deliver services that are equivalent to what we like to see in Australia, but they do operate at some level. And service provision doesn't just have to look like how we envisage it in the West. It can just be like communities distributing services and enabling their people to flourish, right? We don't have to buy into those Western notions, but also obviously violence, non-violence can operate. It is just an entire assertion from these guys that that is not possible. But also get some imagination. This is a debate looking retrospectively, reimagining what that continent would have looked like had this policy not been in place, how incentives would have shifted when your only option isn't just violence anymore, where you have incentives to pursue that pathway differently. So with that in mind, let's look at this first question in more detail. What is the response of both movements and states, right? We tell you two clear things in relation to secession movements. The first is now they have a clear criteria to establish. If you want the recognition of the AU, you have to show non-violence. Fairly simple incentive. States, secession movements now know that they no longer can rely on that pathway, and that is basically a default reason why they would be denied. But secondly, it's harder to radicalize people. It's harder to say, we've got no option now. You have to be violent. You have to speak out, because people are not going to buy into that. They're not going to be mobilized by that anymore. That message does not have the same persuasiveness, right? In response, this team says two things. Firstly, well, we don't really have any hotbeds of violence right now. Firstly, that's not true per examples given in both speeches. But this is not just a debate about right now, this is a debate about historically, this is a debate about into the future. Also, their own examples in later speeches contradict the idea that there is not violence right now. Then they say, but this emboldens more separatist movements. So you didn't have them before, now they're like, oh, we might get some statehood, and they become separatists. No, this also seems contrary to some of their points above, but I just think, as I sort of established in my introduction, the desire to have autonomy, the desire to have a separatist state is a pretty intrinsic factor. It's something that you either want or you don't. You don't just change that policy because the AU now says it's okay. So I just think the desire for statehood is intrinsic. The way you respond to it is not. Then in terms of the states in question, the states that might be losing some territory now, how do they react? Because they say they'll react badly, they'll respond oppressively, more violence, etc., etc. We tell you a couple things that get very little engagement. Firstly, that now the state who is enacting that violence looks worse because now you're cracking down on a legitimate secession movement rather than a group of violent radicals, right? It looks worse in the eyes of the international community. It's much harder to justify as a response. Secondly, though, the AU can play a role as a negotiator. Now, it's much harder to say, oh, we're worried about our citizens and the safety that they'll have living over the border town, etc., because those fears can be appeased. You can now have the AU say, okay, we're going to step in and help with the negotiation process. We're going to ensure that there's a degree of protection for those citizens and those sorts of things. That helps to at least alleviate on some level the concerns of those citizens. But I would just note the comparative. These states are already pretty fucking oppressive to a lot of citizens, especially ethnic minorities of those citizens in a lot of countries. So this team needs to be comparative about the scale of violence, which is already being enacted on citizens for decades to come. So I think we win the question of violence, and obviously people dying, pretty fucking significant impact in this debate. Yes?
Yeah, your part to victory relies upon 3 hurdles. First, you don't have fiat to make it conditional. Secondly, you don't prove that they will form a state despite the context of violence. And thirdly, you don't prove that African Union recognition is sufficient to make it a very, very functional state, given the very, very complex process.
That's great. I'm going to deal with that now. We explained to you that once you get some degree of recognition of statehood, this is good for a few reasons. One, it means you just have more autonomy to be able to enact the legislation, conditions, and things for your people that are good for those people. Needs that might be different, for example, to the needs of the country in which you're separating from. Secondly, you can interact with institutions more, institutions like the ICJ, and thirdly, you can trade, get access to finance, loans, and those sorts of things. And I know the importance of this, right? Because I think we win on the metric of violence, but this is also a very important metric, right? The ability to deliver for your citizens, to enact policy that is right for them, because God forbid, the policy that might be right for the ethnic minorities in Morocco and Algeria might be a little bit different than the rest of that country, right? And then their response here is to say, well, you don't have automatic international recognition that follows, therefore this is a bit of a, doesn't really achieve much by way of pragmatic benefit. A few responses to this. Firstly, note that some of our material is not contingent on this international recognition, right? So your capacity to legislate for your state and do so in a way that is much freer is not contingent on the rest of the world recognizing that. Secondly, states have a strong incentive to follow what the AU says. Maybe there are some states that won't follow what the AU says, but there are a big group of states that are not recognizing secession movements and would recognize secession movements at the point where the AU recognizes them. And no, I would contest that a lot of countries aren't opposed to secession writ large. For example, China is not generally just opposed to the principle of secession, but the specific example of Taiwanese secession, right? And thirdly, you don't need complete recognition to achieve some benefits. Sure, maybe you need some complete recognition to get access to the ICJ, but you don't in order to trade with ASEAN. You just need recognition from that collective of countries. So we get pretty significant benefits there. In terms of AU disengagement, I think that Connor's already responded to this adequately, but let's be clear. Many of the reasons that they point to in terms of the fears from these countries are things that can be resolved. For example, providing assurance that citizens who are left on the secession territory will be protected. And some of the harms that they point to as well are contingent harms. For example, you won't want to buy into this because you're worried about civil war breaking out. If civil war doesn't break out, then it's no longer a concern. But we provided a suite of reasons as to why the trade-off to leave the AU would be significant. Some of the very things they themselves point to, for example, the fact that you no longer have the collectiveness and the capacity to negotiate seem like pretty significant things that you wouldn't want to give away. But I would just posit that this is less significant than the considerations of violence, but also the principal considerations we've given you that are important in this debate, the capacity for people to manifest their own destiny, to be able to be recognized as an independent identity, and to be able to move away from the colonial borders that have been dictated to them. This is a certain harm, one that is non-negotiable and one that is not contingent on any sort of practical impact. For the collection of these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Good to go? The great tragedy of this affirmative team is a forgetfulness that separatist movements ran roughshod over the continent for several generations, and it killed millions. It tore the place apart. There are countries that have not been able to heal the national wounds that were opened when brother fought brother and much blood was shed on the continent. When they reformed the African Union, Somaliland was an open question. It had existed for a long time. And the African Union, alongside every other country in the world, neglected to recognize it. And the reason that they did so is that they recognized that the tensions that are represented by secession are not weak, they are not marginal, they cannot be papered over with legalism, with a reliable court process. They in fact run extraordinarily strong. That was the hostility that we appealed to at the beginning of this debate. That is the hostility that the opposition immediately, literally ignores in their first speaker's speech, then barely grapples with subsequently, and it is that hostility that makes this such a dangerous concept. Two substantive questions in tonight's debate. Firstly, what happens to the African Union if we do this? And secondly, what would the procedure that the opposition describes look like? Before we get there, two important brief points of extraneous rebuttal. The first one is to the idea that inherently the arc of justice in the opposition's world tends towards post-colonial states. Ludicrous! The most prominent example of a post-colonial state is Somaliland, the successor state to a British mandate. And that is because, as Brendon tells you, and they never even think about for a moment, the reality in this debate is that the power relations that we are talking about are not discussing long dead, pre-colonial relationships, but power structures that were molested by the colonies. So while it is absolutely the case that some of these secession movements are good, it is equally the case that many of these secession movements represent a reversion. They cannot claim that, they never dealt with that response, so they have no principle. But secondly, the opposition wants to assert that people have a right to self-reliance. Well, the first observation to make is that, of course, some of that is being represented at the moment, and the second response, obviously, to that is that it is contingent upon the formation of these states. Yes?
Yeah, we're saying that if you want to revert to a particular border that was imposed by one aspect of colonialism at some point as a post-colonial state, that should probably be your choice, rather than being bound to yet a different set of colonial borders that are arbitrarily chosen for you.
It is worth pointing out that those were borders that were affirmed by the African Union when they refused to do this. Right, so if you're talking about what is the most recent actor that agreed with the borders that were established, it's the member states of the African Union who voted in a majority election to support the existing borders, right? So I think on sort of a factual basis, based on, I suppose, the linearity of time, incorrect claim, right? So let's now move to the first question here. What happens to the African Union? The opposition requires the African Union to be strong for their policies to work. If the African Union is not weak enough to successfully basically compel countries to allow secession that they do not support, then there is almost no benefit. The only benefit is you can go to African Union conferences, which are not super important, and you can be a proxy to hearings at the ICJ, which, as we have all recently learned, means about as much as no money at McDonald's. It's fucking worthless. So not much of a benefit if the AU is not strong. But also, we give you two crucial harms. Firstly, the idea that you massively undermine the ability of the AU to act collectively in terms of trade negotiations, which really I cannot understand how important that is to the development of the continent, particularly in its farming industry's negotiations with the EU. And secondly, in terms of its ability to effectively do conflict negotiation. The AU remaining strong is more important than secessionist movements necessarily being able to flourish everywhere that you would want, both because their mechanisms require it, but also independently there are important benefits about it. We tell you that states are hostile to secession, as we tell you in the introduction, as we tell you when we appeal to history, as we tell you when we appeal to the reality that these states are terrified of the secessionist conflicts in their past, perking up and killing thousands more of their people, and as the opposition continuously undermines when they merely appeal to the general dissatisfaction with colonial borders, which ignores the fact that those colonial borders represent power structures that currently exist and represent actors who have very concrete and distinct interest in the maintenance of those borders, right? And given that hostility, we describe to you that this represents a direct threat to the AU as a project, both because it threatens the sovereignty that is the core of the signed charter of the AU, and because it represents a perceived endorsement of movements that are hated by the governments of these states. What are the opposition's responses? The first thing that they tell you is, well, people will still participate in the AU because they have historically participated in the AU, as if you change the most important component of the governance structure of an organisation, an appeal to historical participation is then going to be something that matters. Obviously, the change there means that linearity doesn't matter. Secondly, the idea that people are able to access significant benefits in this context. But the problem is, particularly at time of founding, but also now, the AU does not have a lot of money. It does not have open borders. It is mostly a multilateral discussion venue that has certain procedural elements attached to it, like courts and stuff. They're good, but they're not that good, right? It's not an enormous benefit you're able to access. The third thing that Connor tells us is that some states do not have secessionist conflicts. Bennett tells you factually to no response that more than half of the nations that we're talking about do, so it is not obvious that enough of them care about it. And finally, and I think least successfully, this idea that, well, we're talking merely in the abstract. And because states signed up to this in the abstract, they're not going to care about it. And the problem with that is that they're not dealing with the abstract. These were states who had secessionist movements. So they're talking about the application of this policy, not to an abstract secessionist movement, but to the one that existed, right? And so obviously, what you would see is that some nations would functionally refuse to participate. They would wind down their participation. Some nations would potentially leave. Nations would be less likely to use the AU as negotiating vessels with foreign nations. They would instead engage in bilateral negotiation with foreign agencies, and all of the impacts that Brendon tells you. There's one last way, though, that the opposition might be able to scrape out of this debate, and it's making the process work extremely well, okay? The problem with this is that it is implausible. So let's look at that second issue on the process working well. So the opposition describes a criteria here, and I think the two key elements to that criteria are, firstly, that you're able to functionally provide a state, and secondly, that you are able to be peacefully democratic. So we described two classes of objections to this. The first one is that nations under sanction by the United States struggle to operate as a state. The Somaliland example, I think, is an important one. Somaliland cannot secure its own borders, which almost all international law describes as an important component of being defined as a state. Somaliland is not capable of providing policing to a majority of the country, which means that often there are sub-governance organisations in there who act contrary to the interests of the state, and so forth. But secondly, we tell you that the relevant question is beforehand, right? And what we tell you here is that states, most of the secessionist movements are not as developed as the opposition assumes. They don't control land, they can't guarantee these things. They're still quasi-militarist movements. And what we tell you is that the response of states when they see an uptick in secessionism because there has now been this new incentive for all of the reasons that both teams kind of agree will happen to participate in it, and this is the real killer, states will not let them go quietly into the night. States will obviously do what they currently do, which is preventing them from getting to the point where they are able to engage in the sort of activities that would allow them to meet the opposition's criteria. Which means we are not talking about strong secessionist movements that are capable of getting states. We are talking about an explosion in the number of secessionist movements, but very few secessionist movements being able to meet their criteria. And along the way, there would be far more bloodshed. Ladies and gentlemen, if you understand the history of this place and the disaster that this instability would propose, you must oppose.